Okay. Right. Okay. So, how are you all? How are you coping?
Yeah. Coping.
It's really strange. So I hope you're okay, and you've signed up to the web page about what trying to cope in these weird times. And look, just if you want to chat or anything, B, hello B, how are you? If you want to chat about anything to do, I mean, obviously to do with this course, but just generally, just drop me an email and we can work out a FaceTime or something like that. Okay.
Thank you.
So, well, thank you for organising the Facebook page. That's terrific. So, look, we've had a few issues this morning. What are you having for breakfast, Savannah?
I'm sorry. It's just hard.
Excellent. So we've had a few technical glitches this morning, which is why the grand plan to have Adena presenting a recorded lecture hasn't worked out. But it's even better than that, because somewhere, when I bring her up,
I'm here.
Adena, hello, can everyone see Adena?
Yes.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Excellent. So what we're going to do instead is Adena and I will have a conversation generally about how she got into the business, her practice, her aesthetic, looking a bit more detail at Titus. I will bring in, while we're talking, I'll sort of try to share screens and go in and out of some of the visual images. Now, I'm aware that on the web page, so look, the thing about how these web pages are going to work for the Moodle sites is that they're going to be incrementally longer. So I don't want you to be freaked out. You know that last week I'd said a whole load of stuff with clips from the RSC, the Globe, and the Bell Titus, and some other clips to look at. Did you manage to look at them?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then this morning I started uploading stuff about this week. So the pattern will be that each week there should already be some content about the directors that will be there. Alex, you've got to stop this. It's making me laugh.
Is it going on to me? I thought I'd muted.
And look, you have to tell me how to do this. Okay, enough anarchy. Enough anarchy.
Hello. Hello, Adena.
All right. So you know what we should do? We should have a conch to hold when somebody's speaking. All right. So the way it's going to work is that before the week that we're meeting a director, I will have uploaded stuff. So you'll see for next week, there's a whole shed load of theatre that Simon Phillips has done, and interviews with him. Couldn't be more different from Adena's style. Although you did assist Simon, didn't you, Adena, on something? What was
13 years ago.
13.
On a Tom Stoppard production of Rock and Roll. So no, I know Simon. He's great. He's lovely. Well, as do you.
But couldn't be more different in terms of the aesthetic or the approach. No, all right. But then in the morning of that class, Simon's class, there'll be new material uploaded. Hopefully I can get it uploaded by the weekend before, so you've had a chance to look at stuff. Okay, so today we're going to have a chat to Adena, talk about processes. You'll see that there are 3 links via Dropbox to what she's recorded, but in terms of putting the whole thing together, we had a few technical issues. There are also, which we uploaded today, recordings of the Book of Exodus that she did. Was that last year, Adena? Year before?
No, it was 2017.
Really? God, time flies.
Yeah. Which is the last thing I've done in Melbourne.
Really?
2017.
Crazy stuff. And then the sort of psychedelic Freudian nightmare of Wizard of Oz that we did at Belvoir. There's the full recording of Antigone, which I know some of you will have seen in your first year. And I am still struggling to upload the full recording of Titus because living in the country, my internet is on my phone. I'm at the mercy of Telstra's hotspot. Okay, so I just want to start by first of all saying thanks, Adena, for turning up. And
That's okay. I'm sorry that my links are so messy, and technically it was all a bit of a we didn't know if this session would happen or it did, so it was all, I got a whole lot of stuff very last minute to Jane, so hopefully you'll get to look at it. But I actually think it's better to chat anyway, really.
Yeah, okay.
Casual, whatever. It's not
so I want to start off by asking, has any one of you seen one of Adena's shows? It probably wouldn't work out in the timing. If you'd been here, you know, if you were 2 years ago, you would have seen something. Was that Gio?
Yeah.
Have you seen something of Adena's?
I saw Antigone.
Right.
Oh, cool.
Right. Was that at school?
Yeah.
Was that with your VCE? Yeah. And that's a weird thing too, because the context of that, having seen it as a VCE play, is completely surreal, actually, I would say. No,
Jane and I, that's quite strange, but great.
It's highly inappropriate, actually.
Yeah.
Okay, so Adena, can you start off by telling us about basically why you got into a directing, how you did, what your training was, and your first couple of gigs?
Yeah, cool. Hi, everyone. Apologies if some of this repeats what I said in the video, but I think it's okay. It means you can ask me some questions. I mean, I was directing a couple of pieces at high school. Not thinking it would be something I could actually do as a career necessarily. It was just something I really loved doing. And then when I left high school, I did an amazing course called Creative Arts at Melbourne Uni that no longer exists. And that was, it had 4 disciplines. So you could do creative writing, theatre studies, visual art, and film. It was half theory, half prac. And you could actually work from any discipline. Like, I mean, I could have done a painting course, even though I can't paint. I never dared to do it. But you could actually sort of pick and choose from any of the 4 disciplines. And it was super experimental and really progressive. And, you know, they would be like, I remember on my first day, there was a thing that was naked in a, like a kind of glass shelf just in the foyer doing some like 24-hour durational performance, and I was like, okay, welcome to uni. Like, it was that was the kind of world that I was in. And at that time, which I sort of talk about in the video, I actually majored in creative writing and theatre, and I sort of thought I would write, but was directing kind of at uni, you know, just as part of Union House Theatre and part of Creative Arts as well. It was a really cool community of artists, and a lot of people like myself who didn't necessarily have a specific discipline at the time, but just knew we wanted to be artists, we wanted to be creative people in some way, and we were sort of finding our feet. So I directed a bit at uni, and then and then at the end of it, I sort of really just thought to myself, quite practically, and I'm not a very practical person, but I thought, if I don't choose something specific, I'm gonna not choose anything. And it felt like directing was something that I felt like I was the worst at out of the things that I was doing, and it was the thing I knew the least about, or I didn't feel the most comfortable in, but it was the thing I really loved the most. And so I knew that if I really wanted to enter into it properly, I'd need to kind of go, you know, really kind of go forward. And I spent a couple of years after that, you know, doing some shows with some friends from Creative Arts, and then in 2007. So I was at Creative Arts 2001 to 4, and then I did directing at VCA 2007, which was a postgrad, and then they offered for the first time a master's in 2008. So I did the 2. And so yes, that's my kind of my oh, sorry. Hello.
Hi there. Was somebody asking a question?
No.
No. Okay. So sorry, Adena. Back to you. You just finished your masters.
I just finished my master's, and so as part of my master's course, it was practical. So we directed a show, and then we wrote a paper on it. But I directed 2 shows during that year. One which was not part of the course, and one which was. And these were really, I guess, what I'd kind of call the beginning of what I now call my kind of body of work. Even though I had been doing things in the years beforehand, I felt like it was a lot of trial and error and just kind of picking up whatever was. But this was the beginning of really carving out, some kind of more personal approach and aesthetic and some questions. And so the piece that was not part of the course was something called This Is For You. And it was I've attached a link to it. It was a piece I did at La Mama in 2008 with a live artist named Bridget Jackson. And her and I created this piece, which was inspired by a photographer named Francesca Woodman. I don't know if any of you know her work. She's become more well-known over the years. There's been a couple of documentaries about her. And at the time, she was well-known, but there'd just been a couple of books released. And it was one of those things I would just at readings, like looking at art books that I could never afford. And I became sort of obsessed with this book that I kept going back to have a look at. And I just sort of haunted me in that first year of VCA, thinking, I think there's something in this. And her body of work is all self-portraiture, and she sort of set up these environments in which she would photograph herself disappearing, kind of again and again in various ways. And I became interested in the idea of creating a solo work with Bridget, whose work somehow felt like Francesca's. I'm going into a lot of detail here. Jane, stop me if it's too much. Which was about creating a kind of a series of acts of disappearances for an audience. But the work was quite explicit in terms of its the way it related to Bridget's body, and she was often nude or transforming herself in various kind of quite sort of very delicate and intimate ways, but quite explicit ways at the same time, if that makes sense. It was a very kind of feminine aesthetic, both in its gentleness, but in its violence. She called it a careful violence. That was a very interesting kind of way of putting it. And that work was about the first time I really explored the idea of the audience's gaze and what it means to ask an audience to come into a room and just be with a performer, be with a female performer, their body. And it was a wordless piece, I suppose, like a series of choreographic or kind of performance art type of events, which we watched, which structurally was really made very little sense now that I look back on it. We just made material and stitched it together and put it on the stage. That's sort of what it was. But it was, for me, I would kind of think that's the beginning of where I started to think about a lot of the questions that I continue to do. And then my master's piece.
Can I just ask you about that? Because this is interesting. So, and there are two things. There's the very practical thing. So it was at La Mama, you said? Okay, so this is incredibly practical. You are still at uni, you're still studying, I mean, admittedly at that postgrad level, and you decide to do a show at La Mama. So I'm thinking about, you guys might well decide that that's your first starting point. How did you actually know, how did you learn to book La Mama and about that as a venue, and just the nuts and bolts of finding the money to do this?
It's a good question. I mean, La Mama as a space was one I'd seen a lot of work there, and I had, it had been a big influence for me during my undergrad, and I just would go to see whatever was on. So I knew it as a venue, as did the other artists there. But actually, the way we got the money was in 2007, in the year before. One of the classes at BCA was like, I can't remember what it was called, it was like management, some sort of theatre management course, where we had to write a fake grant. And I asked Bridget, I thought maybe we should write a real fake grant and test it out. It was a $5,000 young artist grant from the city of Melbourne. And so we proposed this project, and then after the assignment, we actually submitted the grant and got it, which was amazing. And I don't think I got another grant for about another 7 or 8 years after that. So I suggest those young artist grants, if they still exist, I'm not sure, are very, very good.
They probably won't exist after this year, unfortunately.
It's fairly grim, but it was fantastic because it was $5,000, which meant that I don't even remember, we all must have been paid a very small amount. The set elements and lighting elements were very, very cheap. I actually can't remember if La Mama charged us for anything, but I don't think they did. I think we just went to speak to Liz Jones at La Mama, handed her a proposal, went and met with her upstairs in the office, and put it in the season. And from memory, we just got box office back to pay ourselves back. The collaborative team was a group of all students except for Kelly Ryle, a composer who I've now worked with for a long time, and he'd been a guest artist at VCA. So I think in retrospect we paid him more just because we really wanted to have him, and that was a huge kind of coup for us to work with him in that way, because he had been a guest artist while we were students, and I mean, as time's gone on, we're very kind of close collaborators in a very different, very kind of equal way. Maybe we paid him more. I can't actually remember, but yeah, it was a $5,000 project, and La Mama was great because I think it was just free. And
and look, that's something for you guys to think about, using, for those of you enrolled in 3833, unless Felix has changed the syllabus, there should be a week or two about writing grants. So being strategic about that would be really handy. And for those of you who are masochistic enough to be thinking about doing an honours project, don't forget that half of the honours project can actually be your own production, and we do give you $1,000 to do that. So I'm not spruiking for honours, I'm just saying that it is a way in if you're interested. But actually the honours is an interesting thing too, because throughout your career, and you know, I know this from personal experience of you, Adena, you are fascinated by the female gaze, you're fascinated by the naked body, and that often can take precedence in terms of the aesthetic over ideas of the text. So I'm interested for you to talk about the synergy between your academic readings and how you can apply that in embodied performance. Because I think it's easy for some of us not to get the connection. You know, some of you might have read articles from I know Kristeva or Sisu, or even something as practical in terms of theatre as Anne Bogart. But letting that inform the aesthetic of your performance is something that can take a while to click. Whereas I think for you, Adena, it's always been something, I mean, I've noticed in the shows that I've done with you that there's an underlying knowledge of a body of theory, which is then informed into embodied practice. So would you mind talking to that a bit?
Yeah, no one's ever asked me that question before, so I hope I can sort of answer that in a concise way. But I encountered a lot of sort of feminist theory and queer theory when I was at Creative Arts, and that's where I started reading. Whether I really understood it at the time, I'm not sure, but it was a world that I had been entered into, and particularly theorists like Judith Butler or Kristeva, who are very particularly talking about the body, I was always interested in. And I think, I mean, I guess maybe in retrospect, I never read those texts in a very analytic way. And when I was asked to write about them in an analytic way, I could, but that wasn't really my interest. And I think because they are actually some of them can be very visually rich, actually, as ideas, and they're sort of feeling based as well, and they're about sensations and affect and the experience of being in a body, or the experience of identity, or these are people who are trying to use words to explain things that are very, very complicated and are about our existence and the experience of, you know, of sort of being in some way. And I think I just drew a lot of inspiration from them rather than necessarily becoming some kind of expert on theory or anything like that. But I still do draw inspiration from them. And I find it, because they're speaking in conceptual ways and abstract ways and sometimes poetic ways as well. And particularly someone like Kristeva sort of speaks about writers and speaks about language and silence and poetry and the body and the relationship between all those things. I guess it's an area that that helps me in some way. And I think that's right, that I'm more interested in the kind of experience of the live body on stage and the ways that we can create encounters that are intimate or extreme or sort of exceed the limitations of our normal interaction. I mean, particularly in a world like this, we're on this, you know, funny Zoom call, and, you know, it's sort of like this theater can kind of can explode open the sort of distances between us and kind of go into a very internal place as well in relation to the body. And so often the kind of myths that I choose to explore, or the narratives or texts, are sort of vehicles towards creating an exploration around bodies, whether that be about identities or the way patriarchy imposes itself on the body, or the way that different people with different identities are impacted by their histories and how those things are written on the body or written on the voice. And so I mean, maybe vehicle is the wrong word, because it feels like I'm sort of using this text for another purpose. Maybe I am, I'm not sure, but I'm sort of always looking, when I say vehicle, I mean like a frame or a sort of, or a kind of, whether that be a narrative frame or with a context like Wizard of Oz, that's an iconography we all know. We kind of all know that story. We all know the tornado and the witch and the slippers and the dog, and sort of in a way going, okay, well, all of those bits and pieces, that narrative is a meeting point between myself and an audience, and definitely in the room between myself and the performers. But it's sort of using that iconography as a way of going towards something else, towards a deeper exploration of gender or power, of, you know,
so
psychology.
you're kind of inspired thematically rather than textually. I mean, it's not like you think,
Yeah.
here's a text, I've got to do this text because I absolutely love, I don't know, the Oresteia. You think to yourself, this is something that this text or this stimulus is something that can allow me to explore the themes that interest me?
Yes, definitely. And I think that's why I find it very difficult if an artistic director says, what would you like to direct next? And I always just think, oh, I don't have a normal bucket list, if that makes sense. Yeah. I don't have that kind of adds up where my bucket list right now is, yeah, from the Oresteia to Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory to, you know, like they're very strange combinations of things, because I'm interested in what's underlying those texts more so, about theme and also about sort of texture and sensation. And I mean, at the moment I'm kind of going, and I think many of us are going, there's a really strong sensation of something happening in the world, and it's more about trying to find something that can kind of contain that in some way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But then once I do find my way into a myth or a text, then I do enter into that text at full force, or analyze it. I'm not just sort of, or I hope not just sticking things on top of it, but it's sort of about going through it to find something else too. So it's about wanting to be taken elsewhere as an artist as well. And those texts and myths always take me to even if I think they're about one thing, they end up inevitably being about many, many other things as well.
So can we go then to 2010? You've graduated from the VCA. Now this is the serendipity. I said in the first week about the weirdness of the way this industry works. And so, you know, for me as a practitioner, when I moved to Australia after having had a really nice career in the UK, I had no idea how to get into theatre, so I gave up for 10 years and taught classics at Monash. And then through a really weird set of weirdnesses, a play, I was asked to write a play which ended up starting my career. So there I was in France, in Paris, at an Airbnb with my little 3-year-old on my lap, and I'm on the internet reading Alison Croggan. Alison Croggan is kind of our best theatre reviewer, and she had a blog called Theatre Notes. And so I was reading this, and it was talking about this production by this young wunderkind, Adena Jacobs, and saying that Alison had heard on the grapevine she was about to do Sophocles' Electra. Now, most of you will know that is the play that has obsessed me through my entire life, and I've played every part in it, and I've directed it twice, and I did my PhD on it, so I'm a complete nerd. And there I am in Paris reading this, thinking, oh, God, that's really interesting, and bugger, God, I'd like to be in that. But of course, not knowing anything about it or about this new director. And then I get back to Melbourne, and sure enough, there's an email from Adena saying, can I come and talk to her as a classicist about Sophocles' Electra? Mm-hmm. And we meet in a cafe and have this kind of, I don't know, it's pretty good conversation, you know, where I'm trying not to be sort of the nerdy classicist. And then I think it was that evening, got an email saying, you wouldn't like to play Clytemnestra, would you? So those sort of weird serendipities are really important for you as fledgling directors to pursue. Basically, you know, so many things in my career in the UK happened because I wrote to a director and said, can I take you out for a coffee and convince you why I should play this part? And I did actually try to do that with Simon Phillips. I took him out for a lasagna at Melbourne Theatre Company, but I did not get cast in Gender Blind As You Like It, which probably won't happen now anyway. So there you go.
So there you go.
But the gumption of actually contacting people is really important. So Adena, yeah.
Yes. I will talk about my gumption as well, because I think it is really important. I guess I'd sort of forgotten about that story about Kelly Ryle, you know, in that piece in 2008. And similarly, I guess, in a couple of productions I did before Electra 2, where I felt like nobody knew me. I was just sort of, you know, trying out a whole bunch of things and making connections with people. But very, very early in my own career, it took a huge amount of guts to contact someone and say, hi, I've seen you in this production, or would you like to come and do this, particularly for no money, and particularly you don't really know me, and this could be a disaster, and, you know, here we go. And it is a big risk, but well worth taking every single time, because the person you ask has their own set of requirements and priorities, and will be able to say yes or no about whether they want to enter the conversation with you, or whether they want to, you know, take that risk themselves. And that's something to always remember, that, you know, you never know where in somebody's journey or career you might be encountering them. And certainly, yeah, when I'd seen Jane and Sappho at the Malthouse, which is the piece you're talking about, and which I loved, absolutely loved, and then had approached Jane to ask for kind of advice in a way, or kind of brainstorming session about the play, and had been looking for a Clytemnestra at the time. And then, yeah, it was only, the whole coffee I was thinking, should I ask her? No, I'm not going to ask her. I don't want to put her on the spot. I want to put her on the spot. So then wrote later on, you know, via email. And I guess I wouldn't have known at that point the extent to which that particular play had been important to Jane, and then would have had no idea then what kind of collaboration. I mean, that was 10 years ago. It's a decade ago. How many pieces we've done since then, and how that collaboration has grown and developed, and it has also opened my mind to a particular way of working with text, and yeah, I mean, from that to Titus, there's been many permutations. It's fascinating, kind of,
There's
in
been
its
much
own right.
nudity.
much, but yeah. So that stuff is really, really important, and I felt that it also lent a kind of, your presence in that production also lent an expertise to that production that never would have been inside of that work. Otherwise, a lot of the other artists in the project were graduating students at that time. Not all, but kind of most. And that also shifted the landscape of that rehearsal room as well, because it meant that we were operating on a different level. And so yeah, that stuff is super important. And I still do that now. Every single time I do a production, I still have to say, dear blah blah, you know, would you like to come and, you know, and it's as nerve-wracking for me to ask, you know, like an 8-year-old at you know, like for the shows I've done with kids, I've gone to school assemblies, as it is a very experienced actor, because you don't know, the director does put themselves in a vulnerable position every time, but you just never ever know what other artists are fascinated in doing. You don't know.
And the connections too, because the upshot of that, I worked with on the Sappho play I did with the artistic director of Malthouse, as was then Marion Potts. She came to see Electra to support me, and then I had supper with her the next week, and she was saying, so tell me about this Adena, what's she like then? And it's again who you know, it's that network. I mean, obviously it's the talent, it's Marion seeing this show and thinking there's real talent here, but if you can work with people who have contacts with other people, then that kind of puts you in the network, and that's really just in terms of your career, it's really important.
It's really, really important to kind of, and I think there's something that I've kind of continued to think about throughout my whole career, which is that it's about on one level, in terms of my collaborators, I need a leg to stand on, meaning I need to have some people, whether that be designers and creative team or performers who I know really, really well, or I know they work really well, and that's solid. And then I also need to introduce other people into that equation who will challenge me in totally unexpected new ways, who I haven't worked before, or whose work I've really admired, or who bring a totally different energy or different expertise, so that it kind of so that there's an element of, it's always challenging, always surprising regardless, but that it stretches me to my absolute limit, and also opens, from a career perspective too, it opens new, just new collaborations and new contexts and new experiences.
Great. Okay, could I ask, so Emily, you've just asked a question. Would you like to ask it in real time? On casting?
Sure.
Hi.
On casting, because you were talking a little bit about that, how do you find your cast? Do you ever audition? Do you just ask people whose work you like, that you've seen in something, like, I want to work with you? How do you work that out?
It's a good question. I mean, it changes project to project, and it's changed over time. I'm not particularly good at running auditions, and it's probably to do with what Jane was talking about, being thematically driven and also process driven. It's really important to me to work with performers who can work in an exploratory way and an improvisational way as well, and who can work very much with their bodies, as well as, if text is a core part of the project, also with text. So there's a lot of requirements there. I think it's quite particular, and sometimes I've just encountered, sort of emailed or called or met with people whose work I know, or who have worked with other artists who work in a kind of similar or kind of compatible way. But often I will meet with them and have a coffee, or try to develop a bit of a relationship first. I would never sort of just bring someone in blind in that sense. There have been some times when I have done auditions. I worked at Belvoir for 2 years as the resident director there, and when I got there, I had this thing that I needed to be like a real director who had ran auditions and ran big general auditions, which was a great way to create a kind of accessibility in the company for new artists, and also to meet people. But when I came to casting my first production, I did a very traditional kind of audition process, and I regretted that in the end. Because I don't really work like that in the room, and so I ended up with some actors who were very much up for the process, and some who were very much not, in a way that was very difficult and resistant. And then for the next couple of projects, I did the opposite, which is I just contacted people whose work I really was excited by, or who I'd worked with before. So it's that fine line where you don't want to be sort of too kind of insular about who you work with, but for me it's so important that the actors I have in the room can work in a particular kind of process, or who are at least open to it. That for me is really important. Having said that, I've done a whole range of pieces with young people, children and teenagers, for adult audiences, and even in many productions I've done with professional casts, there have been children or young people in them, including Titus, which we just did. And in that case, I will run auditions, and usually there'll be a mixture of group auditions and solo, and the group will be a kind of mock of the rehearsal, like an exploratory, open sort of rehearsal. And untrained performers are very open to doing something like that in an audition, whereas professional actors, I would never ask them to do that. But it's actually fantastic, because you can really see very quickly who is up for it. And often I can see those performers, the way that they shift throughout a process. You can see certain instincts in that audition, and then they, by being part of that process, develop it in a really amazing way. So it does depend, but I have an anxiety around auditioning, because it's so, and I will push to the last minute, especially with a company. They'll be begging me to lock people in, and I just will not unless I feel like it's absolutely right, because it's the killer. If you have the wrong group of performers in the room, for me, it is just impossible. And that's happened to me very rarely, but when it has, it's really hard. And luckily I've had very amazing rooms, but I've taken it pretty seriously, that casting. For casting is the piece, basically.
Thinking about casting and also how that might relate to you guys as you're starting. I'd just like to bring up, if I can, share this. Can everyone see this picture? No. Hello. Okay. Share screen. Sorry, bear with me while I'm doing technical stuff. Yeah. Okay. Is that cool? Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just trying to. That's not, in fact, the picture that I want. Okie dokie. Bear with me, guys. We'll get this in a minute. fraught outfit.
Imagine that.
Stop sharing. I'm going to stop sharing. Sorry, I just want to have a look at this. I want your website. Here we go. Fraud outfit, Electra, and persona. Right. All right. Let me tab this now. Then. Oh God, where's everyone gone? You've all disappeared. Sorry, bear with me, folks. There we go. Okay, so I want us to look at some of these pictures from. Okay, I'm going to jettison that idea completely, as I haven't worked out the technology yet. Okay, so in Electra, you had pretty much you knew everybody apart from me. Really, I was the ring-in.
Yeah. I hadn't worked with really anyone, I don't think, but I knew them.
Right, so and that was through VCA mostly?
Through VCA.
Yeah, and that's, I think, something that's interesting for you guys, that some of the companies that are really developing now, like Bloomshed, for instance, they're all Monash grads, or they started out being Monash grads, and then gradually more and more people come together, and it can be really useful for your first couple of gigs to see the potential of working with your peers and how that moves on. But so Electra was done in a little now non-existent fringe venue in Footscray called the Dog Theatre. Tiny,
Yes.
isn't it? How many? About 50, 60 audience?
30 seats that we had, actually. We made it smaller than it even was.
Yeah.
And that was also a free venue. I mean, that was incredible. We were going to do the show in the Collingwood car park. I'm not sure if that exists as a venue anymore, but Eugene Tay and I, who was the designer, so I'd worked with the creative team, but not with the actors, but I knew their work. And we went to the Collingwood car park to have a look at it, and it was amazing. But I just said to Eugene, it's just got bad vibes. I just have a bad feeling like we're going to get robbed. I just was like, I don't think we should do this. And so I had this idea for a project and didn't know where, and then just happened to go to the Dog Theatre one night to see a show, and went up to Peter, who ran the bar, who ran the venue, waited till the end of the night and said, are you taking submissions? She said, send me something tomorrow morning. And I sent her, I had this like massive thing prepared because I'd been trying to get funding to no end, and sent it to her, and she said, great, you're in. And it's a kind of incredible, like there's very few of those spaces, but where they do exist, and they do, it's brilliant because it means that you can just begin. And actually practically that show was another $5,000 thing, but I took out a loan from the bank, which I would not recommend doing because it took a few years to pay that back. Then I had to take it out again for the next production. Then it took a few years to pay that back. And then it haunted me for...
and it was sold out, wasn't it? I mean, the show was we had to cram against all Oc health and safety new seats in. So this is, even when a show sells out, you have to be aware of the financial commitment that you need to put in.
And actually that other show that I took out the money for also had been sold out too. They were both small houses, but they both sold out. And so it was just about, it's about budgeting anyway. So that's how that one happened, but I would not recommend that to a friend.
But then of course the big thing happened, the big break was moving from Electra into persona, which was in a way too a huge shift in your aesthetic. So if you guys get a chance to have a look at the Fraught Outfit website, and you'll see the pictures for Electra are, well, it was done on the smell of an oily rag, really, wasn't it? I mean, you can actually see through the aesthetic. When in doubt, stick up some thick plastic lining. And, funnily enough, when I first directed Electra, I also had that sort of thick plastic lining. But moving into Persona, which was done at TheatreWorks, it was an extraordinarily different aesthetic. So again, have a look at those photos. That journey from the aesthetic of Electra to Persona must have been a quantum leap for you.
It was. I mean, I think it's sort of thematically driven. So I think, the way that I thought about Electra was about this kind of female figure who, through text and refused to stop speaking, refused to stop mourning and grieving and using words and utterances and cries and wails, sort of relentlessly in this kind of, in this sort of as an act of as an act of defiance and an act of grief, and amongst many other things. And we had reduced the chorus to one figure in that piece, which was played by Karen Sibbing, an actor. And in the middle of rehearsal one day, I thought, this just feels like a bit like that dynamic in that film Persona, which was about, I'd forgotten that the premise of Persona, Ingmar Bergman's film, is that an actress one night playing the role of Electra goes silent. And then she stops speaking, and then the nurse who attends to her develops this obsessive relationship with her and never stops speaking. And sort of, it's like the woman playing Electra is like a void who the other one falls into and sort of becomes, and they sort of fuse into one person. And it's my favorite film of all time, it's an incredible film. So it kind of was born from that very sort of, it was like a thematic seed, but then aesthetically it was a completely different world. And actually, I mean, it cost more money. It didn't cost that much money, actually. Again, it was all very much borrowed and sort of borrowed and made a little bit more, but it just was the idea of being able to work in scale. And so working in TheatreWorks created the opportunity for me to think about a film adaptation as a series of kind of shots, if that makes sense. So I could play with the idea of zooming in the camera or zooming out the camera, kind of a wide lens or a close-up, and using the body of the theater as a kind of body, as a theater body. I thought of that for the first time, and I'm sorry, I can hear my baby screaming in the next room. As a theater body, and thinking about the female gaze or the eye of the spectator as a camera in some ways. And so it shifted the way I thought about design. It was a different design team as well, so that altered things, but it shifted my relationship to design quite fundamentally.
We've got a question from Greta. Greta, would you like to ask it in live time, or me to read it?
Sure thing, I can do that. Hello. You mentioned before how when you were learning at VCA, you also had an experience with writing, and creative writing was part of your degree. So I was just wondering if that ever informed your work or your choice to focus more on theme rather than text, or if that's come into your directorial work at all and informed your decision to be a director rather than a writer.
Good question. I mean, when I started VCA, so I was working, I was studying under Jenny Kemp, who's an amazing writer-director, and I sort of thought I wanted to, sorry, she's actually shrieking in the background. I thought I'd sort of wanted to model myself on her in the sense that she was a writer who storyboarded her work, but worked in a very visual way and created a kind of these sort of dreamscapes that you could sort of project your imagination onto. It's something I was very inspired by. But then when I started at VCA, that was the first time I really started to read text or theatre text in a more serious way. We hadn't really done that at Creative Arts. And I think when I started to really read those texts, I thought, I'm not a very good writer after all. I don't think I should write my own text. I think I just felt like the kind of working with brilliant text would give me a kind of platform to jump off of that was much bigger. But having said that, I do sometimes write storyboards as part of my process on paper as I'm working. Probably the time I did that the most was Wizard of Oz, actually, because we were devising the work so quickly. It was a 4-week process, and so it was more a way of connecting the whole creative team rather than having to call everyone at 5 a.m. every day and go, I've thought of this new idea for this bit or this new idea for this. I would just draft and start sending and sending, particularly at the end, Jane, when we started remaking entire acts and things like that. It was a way of kind of drafting, but those storyboards are, when I look back at them, I mean, they're really for myself and my team. They're not to be read, they're not documents, but they are really, really poetic, actually, in that they're not saying, well, this person does this and this person does that. They're kind of creating a series of actions, but they're sort of to be jumped off of in the room, I guess, anyway. So I use it in that way. And I'm also just somebody who reads a lot for inspiration, anyway. So more of a reader than a writer, I think, these days, probably.
So Georgie's just asked, which is kind of relevant, if you like, the correlation between the text and the thematics. Georgie, would you like to chip in?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Hello.
Hi.
So I was just wondering, because you work with themes so much, if you can get too caught up in a theme? And like, if so, how do you stop that? Or how do you know when you've gone too far? Or yeah, just instead of going down that, I guess, going down that rabbit hole, where do you stop?
That's a really, really good question. I definitely have been known to do that. And that's particularly for me when I'm working with text or spoken text in a production, because I can sometimes be at fault of avoiding the actual text in front of me for want of a kind of bit of material we've made in the room, or a kind of idea that I've had in my mind. And I mean, I guess my response to that is partly it's to do with instinct. You know, when your alarm bells go off and go, I'm sort of, I'm far away from the source, or or I'm indulging in something. And sometimes you actually have to listen to those instincts and go, well, I am more interested in this. This thing that's happening is actually much more fascinating than what I initially thought. So I'm going to shift the whole, you know, the whole thing. I'll shift the whole paradigm, and we will make this, but it's to make a choice. But I think it is a really good question. I mean, in general, about being honest with yourself as a director, it's a process of checking yourself at every sort of turn, not in a judgmental way, but in a way of going, have I interrogated this, and have I? And I think, I mean, my sort of response to that would be that sometimes it's about just going back to the source. You know, if you know that you've gone way far, and check and go, well, maybe I haven't, I think I have, but I actually I'm gone down this path for a really interesting reason too. It's all, you know, it's very instinctive. Anyway, it's a good question. I'll think about that a bit more.
And I have to say, from an actor's perspective in the room, certainly thinking about Wizard of Oz, it was incredibly collaborative in terms of us all talking through the themes. You know, most of you, I think, will have worked with Emma Valente last year, maybe? No? Oh, okay. Well, then that's completely irrelevant. We'll talk about that another day. But it can be possible, I've found, when you're working in the devising space, that the director becomes the auteur. And is kind of, you know, like we were saying last week, is sort of in control of everything. Whereas with Adena, the experience in Wizard of Oz was absolutely that we were all collaborators. And in fact, you gave us credit in the program as being collaborators, which was a first for me. And I think that helped the themes. I mean, it was chaos, wasn't it? It was controlled chaos for the first 3 weeks of rehearsal. And we weren't even sure that we had a show just the week before we opened. But something about going back as a group collaboratively to what the themes were, I think held it together. And certainly as an actor, I was incredibly proud of that show for staying on track with the completely bonkers dark themes in that book that most of us don't even know about, because you just think about Judy Garland. We've got a question from Natalie, which we'll come back to in just a mo. So I want to, just in terms of Adena's trajectory from the outside, because you're too modest to say this, the opening night of Persona was really fascinating, and this kind of shows how insular Melbourne theatre is, but how you've got to schmooze and you've got to know what's going on there. It seems impossible when you're starting out, but you've actually got to draw the parallel that Adena was just starting out and similarly didn't necessarily know who was watching. So at the opening night, there was everybody who was anybody in the theatre world. And I stood outside having a smoko with Cameron Woodhead, critic for The Age, Alison Croggan, who I think then was still critic for The Australian, Chris Boyd, who was critic for the Herald Sun, and Marion Potts, who was artistic director of Malthouse. And all of us just kind of stunned mullet silence, saying, what the fuck have we just watched? With just awe that we have seen this new talent just bursting onto the scene. And that combination, being able to bring together that combination of critics, but also external theatre practitioners, was it's an incredibly useful skill. So basically find out who's out there and invite them to your shows. Don't expect that they'll come to start off with, but they will eventually. Because at every talkback we had for Bell Shakespeare's Titus, Pete Evans, the artistic director of Belvoir, said that Persona was one of the best shows he's ever seen in his life, and it was watching that that made him think he needed to employ Adena, and that she was the only person he could think of to direct Titus. So that trajectory was, what, 7 years? Something like that, from Persona through to Titus. But people have long memories, and it's about the schmooze and the connecting, as much as obviously being a brilliant show.
It's quite important. It's an interesting one, actually, because I think I sort of, when I left VCA, when I was at VCA in 2008, I had thought that I would I had a lot of energy and a lot of ambition, and I thought I would get out straight away and just start making a lot of shows. And I actually ended up being very sort of shattered by the end of that year for various reasons. And I really didn't make a show for a couple of years until 2010, which was the show The City, which was the one that Jane kind of had read the review of, and then Electra. And then it took another 2 years to make Persona. So in that 3 or 4 year period between VCA and making Persona, you know, I directed a couple of shows and was working for money and doing all those things. But I was sort of, I guess in retrospect, doing two things at the same time. One was just being super, super purist about what I wanted to be doing and not wasting energy on, you know, kind of directing a billion shows just to do it at the time. For some people that is very useful, just on a craft level. For me, that wasn't what I needed. I needed to just really just find the energy to do what I felt like was going to be impossible. And both Electra and Persona were kind of those things at those times. And at the same time, so that was a very internal process in lots of ways. But then on the flip side, I was sort of just participating in lots and lots of community and industry stuff, sort of just forums and workshops and seeing shows and like doing all this kind of things that didn't actually in a way relate specifically to the work that I was doing, but meant that I met a whole bunch of those people that you mentioned, and like some cool things came up with fellowship and, you know, meeting, just being part of the industry and part of the community sort of simultaneously. And so very luckily those two things happened at that time where that show was ready to go, and then some of those people were there, which led to further work. But it's like both of those things are really important in really different ways. But having said that, I think it's important sometimes to not feel like you have to have all of those people at like the very first show you do or something either, because it's when you're ready to, you know, it's like when you're ready to show what you feel like you're ready to show. You know, I feel lucky that years before I'd invited Alison Croggan to a show. She couldn't come, thank God. So, I don't know. It's also about feeling, like you can back what you're presenting.
Mind you, at the same time, we did this funny little one-woman show that was a bit of a curate's egg, which I'd written, which was actually done, performed in the Alex Theatre for one show only. And being strategic, I actually paid for a taxi for Alison Croggan to come over from Footscray to see this, because I thought, okay, you know, we'll see if we can get any decent feedback from her. And something as simple as a mention from her in her blog led to other things. So, you know, be strategic with that. So I'm aware of the time. What I'd like us to do is kind of just skip for 5 minutes from your career, then up to Titus. So you went to Belvoir, you were resident director. And what was really interesting about Belvoir before Adena and then Annie Lou Sarks as well joined, it was the absolute gay boy club. It was totally, and there was huge controversy because for the year, I think, was it 2 years before Adena and Annie Lou arrived, there hadn't been a single woman directing, and I don't even know if they'd programmed any female writers. It was absolutely under the hegemonic control of a certain type of patriarchal gay theatre man. And then a new artistic director came in who wasn't a director, he was a designer, and he brought in Adena and Annie Lou, and that changed exponentially the atmosphere at Belvoir. Annie Lou is quite a, well, I find her quite a traditional director, even though, you know, there's a degree of innovation, but to me she's kind of, she's a bit boring, actually. I have to say, I find her acting, I shouldn't say this, but she's a bit, she can be great, and she can be dull. And then we had Adena, who's kind of, well, you were just a bit, I mean, you're, compared to what Belvoir had usually offered, Adena's work was uniquely, innovatively bonkers. You know, working on things like Hedda Gabler with a male actor playing Hedda, who was he's a brilliant actor. He's actually one of the best actresses I've ever seen, even though he's quite clearly a man. And then doing devised work, having the courage to go out of the box and asking somebody like Pete Carroll, who is one of the most established actors. He's on a par with John Bell, asking him to do a devised production, a two-hander about Oedipus. You know, it's that sort of courage. And then, of course, that leads us to Natalie's question, which is about opera, because the aesthetic changes hugely over the course of your time at Belvoir onto something else. So, Natalie, do you want to talk to your question? Are you there, Natalie?
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, I'm here. I'm not exactly sure how to phrase this, but I guess personally I'm really interested in opera, and that's something I'd love to do in the future. So I got really excited when I saw your work in opera. So basically, I guess people kind of put theatre and opera in different baskets, but I guess I'm just interested in the similarities and, you know, do you approach directing theatre and opera differently, because they kind of both face the same problems, you know, with people going into a room to watch a woman suffer. That's a huge thing in opera. And yeah, like, do you go about interpreting opera differently to how you would interpret theatre, I guess?
Yes, it's a good question. Yes and no. I think I've directed 3 operas, I think, in my time. So 2 with Sydney Chamber Opera, which one was a kind of existing opera but quite obscure, and the other was a new opera work. And I've also used music in various ways kind of within my work. But Salome was the first kind of traditional opera, I suppose, although Strauss isn't super traditional, but it was the first conventional opera that I really made, and it was on a massive stage, very terrifying. And so they've all been kind of different. They've been different, but I suppose the Salome is the closest to other theatre experiences I've had, where it's the same in that I'm sort of trying to explode open the kind of what I think are the outdated structures in it, whether they be sort of gendered or you know, about race or an identity, and trying to create a kind of new language or aesthetic, or if it's not new, but it's what feels like a kind of invented language or aesthetic on the stage, playing with similar themes of female gaze and the body, and notions of violence. And I mean, Salome as a myth is very close to a whole lot of other texts I've done, but what feels really different about it, a couple of things. One is that because the music is set, the emotional temperature moment to moment has been set by the composer straight away. And so I suppose as the director, what I'm doing is creating another layer for the audience to watch that music through, experience that music through, as opposed to creating with the performers the kind of the feeling. I mean, when you're working with actors, they are creating that emotional temperature, if that makes sense, or kind of stitching together the score in conjunction with the feeling that comes from light and sound and design. Whereas in opera, it's set and you are kind of working with it or against it. And actually at every moment in music, I feel like I'm making a choice. Am I going with the music or am I going against the music? And both are really interesting choices. So it's more technical in that way. And that was very frustrating in the Strauss in many ways. I felt even though we spun it 1,000 degrees, I couldn't break it, if that makes sense. I couldn't quite break it. And I wanted to in the case of that text. And then what's incredibly different is just the training of opera performers versus the kinds of actors who I work with who are super exploratory. And working with British opera performers, even though they were quite open, found it very challenging to work outside of the box. And so that was very, very hard. And in theory, we're really up, you know, you have to design everything in advance, and you sort of presented everything down to a final costume. I mean, it was so sort of much more auteur driven than anything else I would have done. Sort of not collaborative in that way, but I'd, you know, they were really excited in theory, but then the doing of it was very hard. And it's not a way that even though I love the sort of the visual scale and the kind of excess of the music and the sort of space of it's kind of incredible, I also have questions for myself about what it is to direct opera. I'm not sure. Not sure what it means. Not sure. So, but it was it was an incredible opportunity. It was amazing. It was amazing that it was that piece as well, and I could bring my own team, and you know. So yeah, it's very, very good.
We've got a question from Ron. Ron, do you want to talk to your question, or do you want me to read it? Are you there, Ron? Okay, Ron has written, because Ron earlier said that it's too early in the morning for him to video. So Ron's written, sometimes I feel like actors might have more control in the play, especially plays in university. Can you talk about how we can direct them without compromising on their creativity? Do you have any experience as a director with actors that has strong personality? And then my environment is a little noisy at the moment. I might not be able to ask in real time. Adena, working with actors with a strong personality, she says, blushing after our last experience together.
No, it's yes, let's define strong personality. I guess let's just be specific about this, about the question. I think I'm trying to think how to distill this answer. I mean, I suppose in relation to what Jane was saying earlier, the kind of collaborative environment, I think for me it's really important to bring, as a director, to come to the room, you know, and to come to the performers with a huge amount of work already done, meaning research, dreaming, kind of design, aspects of design, doesn't have to be all of it, structural stuff, and to have sort of filled myself up with everything possible. But then in a way, what I like to do is then sort of transfer that onto the performer, sort of tell them every single thing I've thought about the piece in a way, and then just throw it out. And then we start on the floor working improvisationally or exploratively, in an exploratory way, with a kind of an idea or an image or a theme or something, which in a way is just a vehicle to get the performers to begin. And to just start to create a language in and among themselves, and for me to start to understand the performers and their instincts, and just try to create a landscape which is feeling driven and image driven. And each one of those performers comes to the room, whether they're university students or professional actors, or, you know, will come to the room with something really strong inside them as a response to that piece. And whether that be a huge amount of research they've done, or whether that's just their own instincts, or whether that's their own life and their own body, and they'll just bring themselves to it. And so I guess I think about directing as, you know, on the one hand, I'm working very personally in terms of my own subjectivity, in terms of the way I frame a piece, but also I'm working very responsively in terms of the performers, and creating a lot of space for myself to watch them, listen, and to work from their tempos, their energies, their instincts, and the information they fill themselves with. And somewhere between those two, you know, we kind of, well, between what the performers are generating and what I've brought to bear, we start to dance in a way. And then I start to kind of think in a different way. They start to think in a different way. We start to build the piece together. And that's whether it's devising a piece without the text, like Wizard of Oz, it relies on the actors very heavily. So I'm trying to think, am I answering your question I guess it's about absolutely never compromising on their creativity. And strong personality is good. And I often cast actors who are directors, and I often cast actors who are theater makers. And I like that, because it means they're bringing everything to the table. They're bringing, you know, their own instincts as an actor, but they're bringing their intellect, their dramaturgical skills, and I want all of it really in the room. It's a bit greedy maybe, but you know, it's a much more interesting space than a space where a director is saying, I want you to do this, and then actors do, because they're always then bringing about 2% of themselves, and you'll never really get the rest of it.
There is something I want to add as having acted with Adena. When I did Electra, I'd never, ever, ever improvised at all. And I remember the first couple of rehearsals where I remember you asking us to improvise a sacrifice. And I was horror-stricken at the thought of having to improvise and the director not saying, this is what we're doing. And it took me a long time, but then the next time we improvised was around Wizard of Oz, and we would do long form improvisation, sometimes lasting more than an hour, with music in the background. Even that's interesting, because Adena, I had to ask Adena not to play Arvo Pärt, because I'm of the generation that grew up at university writing essays to Arvo Pärt. So I did not want him playing in the rehearsal room. But again, terrified. And we had in the cast the amazing Melita Jurisic, who is indefatigable in, I mean, nothing will tire her during an improvisation. The other thing is that I start improvisations incredibly small. I will start with one finger and it might take me half an hour to move up from the other finger, where everybody else is immediately going crazy. Josh Price is taking off his trousers and waving his dick everywhere, and I'm still there trying to move my finger. So I think as a director, from my experience as an actor, if you want to direct in this collaborative devising process, be really aware that actors devise in different ways. And I'm quite comfortable now with devising, but certainly when we did Titus, there were moments when I would drop out of the improvisation. You know, I was going through some shit at the time anyway, so we won't really worry about that. But I would drop out of the improvisation because it was no longer working for me. And Adena was amazing in allowing me to do that, creating the atmosphere where it was okay just to say, all right, they're off doing something completely weird over there. I can no longer attach to this. I'm just going to step out. And I think that's one of the ways that you respect your actors' creativity, that they can't all do it the same way.
No, yeah. And part of the reason of working that way is to understand the actors who are in the room really well, because you can sort of see, even just at the outset, even from a first improvisation, and you learn more and more as it progresses, and everyone sort of sinks into a different kind of, you know, a rhythm too. You start to go, ah, yes, Jane works from a very internal small place, or Melita can work with a piece of string for 10 hours and it can just be some very lateral thing, and et cetera, et cetera. And you start to understand how the people you have in the room, how the artists work, and it's really useful. And I guess I think about improvisation as being, on the one hand, very useful for me as a director to watch and listen, and for the actors to generate material that I can then sculpt and compose, and have a big bank to draw from. But it's also useful as a tool for the actors, or can be, for their own sort of way of filling up or finding information or an emotional logic. And for those reasons, it doesn't matter in a way how well it works on some days and not on others, and what, you know, it's for the actors too, and for whatever it is that is useful for them or not. So it doesn't sort of have to be one thing. Jane, I'm aware I have to go fairly soon because okay. I have to take Peter to be have an injection.
Brilliant. Okay. One final question then from Selena, which fits in really well, and then I'll let you go off, and then we'll talk about the rest of the tasks. Do you have any particular exercises that you regularly use to try and get performers out of their shell that you're finding difficult to work with or less exploratory?
Mm-hmm. I never do games. I never do warm-ups. I find them socially panicking myself, so I would never do that. Although when I was at university and sort of developing different tools and things like that, I would, and they were sort of psychophysical kind of activities, I suppose. But I never anymore do that. So I allow actors. So actors will do their own warm-up, vocal or physical or otherwise, and then we begin. I think I don't have a particular exercise. It will be about molding the way I approach improvisation depending on who I have in the room. So, you know, in a room where I've got people who are less experienced in improvisation, or if I feel that they're uncomfortable, I might guide it more so. So I might sort of speak all of the kind of actions of a scene, or speak all of the actions of the play or something, and so the performers have something to go from, so they know that there's a structure and they know that there's something to follow. Whereas with more experienced people in improvisation, it might just be one tiny thing and then they're off and we play some music, and you know, it's sort of like a jazz process or something. And even then, sometimes it feels useful to inject certain things, inject objects or elements or a task, or to shift things too. But it's different when I find when people are uncomfortable. It's about me giving a sense from the outside that there's something that's guiding them, and often just saying something at the outset, like, you know, I'm not looking for anything in particular. This is just for you. This is just for you to kind of find out information, find out research, find out this. And so it's sort of things which take the pressure off people to think they have to make something amazing. Particularly, you know, if there's a mixed group of people. And I found that when I did Hedda Gabler, which is the piece I was talking about earlier, that was quite challenging. It was a very mixed kind of level of comfortability. And yeah, I think the biggest key I've learned is not to pander to the most anxious member. Like in that particular process of Hedda Gabler, the anxious people were very, very uncomfortable. And then the most open game people were super sort of like into it. And it was very extreme. I've never experienced something like that. And it's important to go with the most open people, but to create avenues for others to work in different ways, rather than to just go, oh, they're all really nervous, okay, we're just like not going to do that. And then it sort of denies everybody a, you know, a process or experience. But it's never perfect, you know. And I guess it's back to casting, really. It's about taking the time to know who is wanting to work in that way. And everyone will have different experiences, but and abilities. But I think it's really important to make people feel comfortable, not just in what you say, but also in the ways that you guide something. So even though I say working improvisationally or in a devised way, it's never just rocking up to the room and saying, okay, everyone, what do we want to do today? Or how do we want to do this? Or just saying go without any, you know, that there always needs to be some kind of sense of a reason or an endpoint, whether that reason is we're exploring this particular image, or we're looking at this scene, or you know, we are going to work with this object, or I'll guide you through, or I won't guide you through, but this is the reason, or so that there's some framework for people to go with. Otherwise it can be very very uneasy, and actually kind of too can become a bit pointless as well, a bit hard for myself to navigate. There always has to be something to hold the space. And I found as those, you know, rehearsal process progress, I mean, you end up needing to say very little, because there's a culture in the room, and there's you know, there's a kind of something's existing. But it's those first early sort of rehearsals and early weeks that are really important to make sure everyone feels okay, and also to do things that are sort of not too serious as well, like to kind of within those things to make sure that it's okay to be loose and funny. Like in Wizard of Oz, I remember, I mean, everyone was super up for it, but the end of that first week, we had this mad improvisation where, like, it was absurd. It was like everyone kind of just went loose. And after that, it was like, there's a freedom that comes where just knowing that, that you can have a laugh as well. I mean, it's very important.
That is a brilliant place to stop. Go and get Vida's injections. Adena, thank you so much for this. It's brilliant. Guys, stay online, because we'll be talking for the next little bit about your tasks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you're all well. Sorry, I have to run, put on some gloves, and go to the GP with me. It's a very odd world. But yeah, if there's any other questions or things, you know, shoot them my way.
Brilliant. Thanks, Adena. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cool. Okay. Thank you so much for your questions. That was wonderful. So look, guys, I just wanted to suggest, obviously the timing has, you know, we've kind of gone into we started later than normal, and next week hopefully we'll be able to stick to the hours of 11 till 2. So the idea behind the groups that we signed up to in the Excel sheet, and I'm aware that I have dobbed some people in as administrators, because I think it was only Michaela and B who put their names down. Thank you. Well, the idea is that you now create a Zoom meeting or a FaceTime meeting, or however you might want to do it within those groups. And I just want you to think about these couple of tasks. You've studied Titus in a number of ways. You've looked at 4 different productions: the BBC, the Globe, the RSC, bits of the Bell. Hopefully by the end of this afternoon, the Bell full production will be uploaded. It will be very, very difficult for you to get an idea of that, because the recording is so crap. There are 2 things you can do. You know, you can decide in a group. You can analyze the 3 different rape scenes, as if this is okay for you guys, trigger warnings accepted, between the Globe, the RSC and the Bell, to try to analyze through your understanding of theoretical frames of performance what's going on in each of them. And there are some very, very different things happening in terms of directorial approach to actors, in terms of the design aesthetic, the use of proxemics and space on stage, the effect that these scenes are having on the audience that you think the director wanted to have on the audience. They're all having very, very different effects on the audience. So one task that your group could do is just this sort of academic analysis, and it can be bullet points. It doesn't have to be much at all. Or your group can decide to do something which is a little bit more creative. You've read Titus, you know, you get your ideas of it, so your group can have a brainstorm. If you were the creative team, you know, director, lighting designer, set designer, musical designer, how would you, what are the themes you would like to bring to the fore, and how would you put this together? Now, they're obviously quite separate tasks, so negotiate in your groups which ones you want to do, the more academic analysis or the more creative approach. And then what I'd love you to do is to just choose amongst yourselves the way in which you would like to encapsulate your findings. So it can be as simple as a PowerPoint. You know, one person puts together the PowerPoint that everybody chips in, and it's uploaded, and it's just something that we can talk to next week. Or it can be that you want to do a little film. You want to film your conversation, your Zoom meeting, like I'm filming this one. You could do a TikTok for all I care. You could, I know, put something on, create an app. The Dean's daughter, who's only 12, for all of her exercises like this, they create apps. What's going on there? Anyway, I know that you guys know way more ways of uploading data than I do. So I'd like you also to be a bit creative, because what this pandemic is showing us is that directors can no longer get away with having a portfolio on paper, turning up to a director and to an artistic director and saying, here's my pitch. Basically, you're going to have to come up with way more interesting tech-savvy ways of doing this. Given that Alex is completely overdoing green screen backdrops, I'm sure that this will not be in any way, shape or form technically difficult for you. I don't want you to spend too long on this. If you think that the actual class that we would have would only be 3 hours, so for us, I would say you've had half an hour of prep looking at the material Adena uploaded. You've had an hour and a bit with Adena. So I'm not expecting that your Zoom meeting will be any more than half an hour, and then there'll be half an hour to sort of create your presentation. So I don't want you going over the 3 hours of the class unless you really want to. Does that sound as though it makes sense so far?
Yeah, just one question.
Yeah.
When do we need to actually upload all our findings by, and where do we actually put them?
Right, well, I was thinking by the end of this week, because then I thought that you'd all have the weekend to have a look at each other's presentations, and then on Monday we could have half an hour just discussing them before we get on to Simon Phillips. Does that sound doable?
Yeah, and where do we actually upload them?
Well, look, I was thinking of opening up a Google Drive for all of you to upload onto that, unless anybody has some better suggestions, because again, this is all new to me. So if somebody says there's a better way to do it via Dropbox, then I'm happy to go with that. But if you've all got Google Drive access, then I could just create a place for us all. Would that be okay? Cool.
Yeah.
Now
I think Google Drive.
Sorry, Alex?
It's just faster to upload everything via Google Drive than it is over Moodle and things like that, from what I've been finding.
Fantastic. Let's all do Google Drive then. I'll create a page and send you the link later today. Hopefully by next week, I will have worked out how to do breakout groups actually from Zoom. No, I will have worked out how to do this. So then you won't have to worry about creating your own Zoom meetings. The other thing I would really love, and I've never used the forum on Moodle before, but obviously now is the time when we should be doing this. by the end of today or tomorrow, I will have opened up the forum, and I would love you, really love you, to give me ideas on what you want from this sort of online format, ways that it can be improved, things that you would like to do in the future, because that would be so useful to me. So yeah, look on the site tomorrow, and there should be something opened up there. Final thing to say is, so did I tell you about the faculty approving intensive stuff? I haven't told you that yet, have I? Okay, so on Friday, we had approval from the university that we can move into intensive mode from week 10. So basically, this means that the hours that you're going to spend with your actors are now still going to go ahead. We had timetabled 6 hours of contact time and 4 hours of presentation time for you to work with your actors on your scenes. And that was going to take us from week 10 right the way through to the exam period. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But what we're going to do instead is work out an intensive way of you doing your scenes over 6 hours in semester 2. That might be 4 hours a day, depending on timetables. That might be that people want to come in at a weekend and I work with you on a Saturday. There are all sorts of possibilities. We don't know when this is going to happen, obviously, because we don't know when we start having classes. But this means that we will actually get our in-contact work on the scenes, which I'm delighted for. If anybody can't do this for next semester, if you're finishing your degree, I will just work out another form of assessment, so don't worry about that. I'll put this all in a video and write it down on the Moodle site so you'll see that. So does that, Google Forums would not use people preferred names when posting? Fair enough, good point, Gio, excellent idea. If somebody can think of a better way of communicating than Google Forums, let me know. Maybe it's just adding to a Google sheet that we can all just Simon, is that better? Let's all do it on Google. I hate forums too. Does that make sense to everybody, guys?
Too many.
Yeah. So any questions, any probs? And you're all cool to start up your own Zoom meetings? Brilliant. I'm now going to pick up my daughter because her school is about to close in 10 minutes for the next 6 months. Homeschooling, yay!
Yay!
Guys, thank you so much for being so engaged in this. It's brilliant. I actually think this has given me so much hope that we can actually make this unit kind of worth doing. So thank you very, very much. All right, guys, contact me with any problems. Really appreciate it. Enjoy your Zoom meetouts. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.